So good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar. Let's begin. So who are we? We are a group of mixed professionals who work in Sitecore platform as developers, architects, business users, content authors, or QA, and are passionate about Sitecore. This is the best platform to learn, present, and network. Also, from today, we are adding two new features that will be participate and earn. So I'll come to the earn part of it. So you can find us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Do make a note of our handles and also like and follow us to get all the updates related to the user group. So our partners. So we have recently partnered with J2 Travel Technologies and are really excited about it. They have a massive implementation on Sitecore platform and will be collaborating with us to share the best practices and also to learn the latest tools in Sitecore which they can leverage. If you are looking for Sitecore opportunities, then J2 Travel Tech is hiring. Please make a note of their LinkedIn handle as well. We are the organizers for SEG Pune. You can get in touch with, we are organizers for SEG Pune. You can get in touch with any one of us if you have any suggestions or feedback for SEG Pune. Our details can be found on about page of our website, that is segpune.in. And the biggest news for today is our speaker of the day, that is John West. I don't want to embarrass John by trying to introduce him. He is a lifetime MVP of Sitecore, also known as Sitecore John. He has spent long tenure of his in Sitecore. Also is WSL and .NET and Headless CMS advocate. Please make a note of his blog handles, that is deliverystack.net and wslguide.net. You can also make a note of his LinkedIn handle, John West 3, if you want to get in touch with him after this call if you have any questions. So the today's topic is SaaS Headless CMS and decoupled Sitecore. So now I'll stop sharing and I'll hand it over to John to take it forward.
Hello, this is John. Can you hear me?
Yes, John.
So, thanks for the introduction and for the invitation to present today. This is one of those unusual presentations that you only give once. So I've never done a dry run on this and I don't know how much content I have or how long it'll take. I did put some slides together, excuse me, but I'll kind of stumble through it. So again, I've never given this presentation before and I never will again. In terms of my background, I've been in the content management industry for about 20 years. I started out working with Interwoven. Excuse me. And eventually, after about 5 years with Interwoven, started with Sitecore. I was at Sitecore for about 12 years, and from when Sitecore was nothing to when it was valued at about $1 billion and had, lots of large customers. So really watched the company grow. And then after Sitecore, I did some work at an agency implementing experience management and content management solutions for about 3 years. And then lately I've been working for a headless content management vendor. I'm not trying to sell headless content management, so I'm not going to get too into the details of which vendor and things like that. But I'm very familiar with content management, with Sitecore specifically, and then now I'm focusing on headless content management. And from my perspective, the headless content management software is basically all the same architecturally. If we look at the architecture, they're all very similar. So while I prefer certain products, they're all basically architecturally similar, so we can talk about them generically. The topic today is really comparing Sitecore's new decoupled rendering SDK. So that's a .NET SDK for decoupled rendering with headless content management, or specifically SaaS headless content management, which is a hosted content management solution with a different architecture. So there are some similarities to Sitecore Decoupled, and there are some differences between Sitecore Decoupled and SaaS Headless CMS. So that's really what we're going to look at. I'm not very good at answering questions and dealing with chat in real time. So if questions come up, let's try to hold them till the end. I'm going to try to spend about 40 minutes on this content, and then hopefully we'll have some time for questions and answers. So I do have a lot of content, and we might end up skipping some of it if I can figure out how to go to the next slide. So the agenda today is to talk about Sitecore's rendering engine. So the default rendering engine that we've all been using, we might call it the layout engine or the ASP.NET engine, the MVC framework. We'll look at Sitecore's new rendering SDK and how that decouples content delivery from Sitecore in a sense. So using HTTPS services to communicate with Sitecore instead of using those native .NET APIs. Then we'll take a look at SaaS Headless Content Management Solution architecture, system architecture. We'll talk about some of the differences between decoupled or Sitecore decoupled and a more comprehensive or complete headless solution, and some of the advantages and disadvantages of decoupled versus headless. So each approach has advantages and disadvantages, and I'll try to be honest about, the advantages of a system like Sitecore that includes a content delivery engine and headless that doesn't. So first we'll talk about the Sitecore rendering engine. So to support inline editing, so that's while the user's browsing the page in the experience editor, they can make changes. Also to let them control the page layout and to have experience management features. So to control which presentation components appear on the page and to do testing and optimization and those kind of things, presentation rules. Sitecore content delivery solutions actually use Sitecore in the content delivery environment. So your content delivery solution in a Sitecore solution sits on top of Sitecore, which sits on top of ASP.NET and the .NET APIs that access the databases. So with Sitecore, your content delivery tier is accessing databases directly, and it accesses some services, but a lot of time it's using native access to the data repository. Sitecore customers host their own content management and content delivery environments, even if they're using Sitecore PaaS, and they're both running Sitecore. So the customer hosts their environments, and those environments run Sitecore. Sitecore provides PaaS or platform as a service for infrastructure for managing the solution, but it's not a SaaS solution. Sitecore might install that software and can provide support for it, but they're not actually upgrading the software for you. It's not a true SaaS environment. Although the new Experience Edge does provide some SaaS services for content delivery. Sitecore also has additional technologies that I'm not really going to talk about. We have the SXA that sits on top of the layout engine. We have JSS, which provides an alternative architecture oriented towards Jamstack. It's not within the scope of this presentation, but it provides a different way of decoupling content management or Sitecore from content delivery, specifically around JavaScript applications. And we've also got Content Hub. And so this presentation is really just focused on the .NET SDK, which came out with 10 and got some kind of buzz at that point. So I think that's good for this slide. This is my high level overview of how the Sitecore rendering engine works. So this is the traditional engine that sits on top of ASP.NET and MVC. And what I'm really trying to get across with this slide is that if you look at content management and you look at content delivery, they're both accessing the content search and experience databases directly. So there's a SQL Server, there's a Solr, there may be a Mongo for XDB. The content delivery tier is accessing all of those databases directly, or data stores. It might be accessing some of them over services, but for performance and just because of the way Sitecore is coded kind of vertically, it's probably doing that direct access over SQL and other interfaces to those repositories. So this is the standard Sitecore layout engine. If we talk about decoupling content delivery, this is kind of my effort to explain it to somebody who's familiar with Sitecore. Decoupled content delivery uses only HTTPS to access the content management system, rather than using any of those native APIs that have direct database connections. So CMS vendors provide software development kits that wrap the services for the technologies that their customers use to access the services. So if I'm a decoupled vendor, I focus on my content delivery services, and I provide a .NET SDK that accesses those services over HTTPS. My customer implements the rendering that uses that SDK to get data from the CMS and present it to the visitor. In a more traditional Sitecore solution, content delivery is really the Sitecore application, the Sitecore content delivery application that's accessing the databases directly, and then rendering is built on top of content delivery. So by decoupling, what we're saying is we're going to make a new set of content delivery services that serve the content as JSON We're going to have a .NET SDK that communicates over HTTPS to get that JSON. And then the rendering is really going to deal with our .NET SDK and those JSON formats. It's not actually going to know necessarily that we're running Sitecore. It's going to be using this API layer. And there are a lot of advantages to that because this is a much more lightweight rendering engine. We can use .NET Core. We don't have to stand up Sitecore here. And it's just a much more agile and testable, and it's a better environment for us to develop front-end applications. And it's kind of insulating the developer from the specifics of Sitecore, although we have to use Sitecore's .NET SDK to get field values and access items and things like that. But we're much less aware of Sitecore if we can decouple, and we can also scale things differently. So if we might want to scale content delivery services differently than the rendering facility. So it gives us a lot of developer capability and scaling capability. So that's really all we mean by decoupling. We're not really refactoring the Sitecore application or re-architecting it. We're just adding a layer, which is this services layer, and then an SDK. These SDKs are basically wrappers for the HTTPS interface. So this .NET SDK doesn't really have any logic in it. All it has is calls that get the data from the content delivery services or pass it back. In the case of Sitecore, to support inline editing, this is really a two-way channel, because if I'm in the page editor or something and I need to experience editor and I need to edit a field, I need to push that back through the content delivery services. So these content delivery services are really two-way content delivery, and there's also a content management interface in there for getting updates. So SaaS Headless CMS is different in a variety of ways. In the headless CMS metaphor, so when we say the word headless, I mean, it's really a bad metaphor and it's kind of confusing, but we can say the body, if we think of a body has a head and a face. The body is basically the content management environment. So the body is where CMS users go to maintain content. Headless CMS vendors provide browser-based user interfaces to manage and deliver content, including media, using HTTPS services. So the headless CMS vendor gives us a browser-based UI. They host the content management environment and provide a browser-based UI to enter the content. And then if we want to access that content, which is text and media, we retrieve it using HTTPS services. So I might have the URL of a media asset. That's how I get a binary. Or I might have the URL of an HTTPS service that serves JSON, and that's how I get content. There really are heads in the headless content delivery solution, but the CMS vendor does not manage them. The vendor manages the body, the content management environment. The heads are the content delivery environments where the visitors access the site. The solution is called headless because the CMS vendor provides a body or the content management environment, but no head, no content delivery environment. Headless CMS customers can implement the content delivery solution using whatever technologies they want. The heads are the part of the solution that the CMS customer manages. So again, the vendor manages the body, the content management environment. The customer manages the heads, which are the content delivery tier. So headless customers can do all sorts of things to get data out of the CMS. They can do static exports to HTML or JSON files. They can implement processes that retrieve content dynamically in the content delivery environment, and they can use service buses and all sorts of architectures that are more challenging with a kind of a monolithic or a stacked application like Sitecore. So in addition to exposing an extensible CMS user interface with HTTPS services, headless CMS customers can configure the CMS to invoke webhooks to integrate with external systems. So this is really different from Sitecore, how Sitecore integrates. Sitecore does expose some services for integration, but a lot of the configuration is on the server side with web config, include files, and things like that. In a headless content management system, you don't touch the server at all. You never you never do any configuration or coding on the content management system itself. You do everything through webhooks, which are when an event occurs in the content management system, call out to some external system, or APIs. So when an external system needs data, it needs to use the service APIs, or by extending the user interface, so embedding custom user interfaces in the CMS. But we never do any backend coding in the CMS itself. We always use services to get to the backend. So the SaaS headless CMS vendors are responsible for these parts of the solution. If you think about a Sitecore solution, the customer is responsible for everything. The vendor provides the software and they might provision the infrastructure in the Sitecore managed cloud, but the customer has to administer all of the entire solution. With a headless content management system, the the vendor hosts the content management environment that we call the body. So the customer is suddenly only responsible for the face, and the face is not running the content management software. It's just, in our case, it would be an ASP.NET Core application that uses the SDK to access those services. So the vendor hosts the services that let us get data into the content management system. That means that they also scale those services. So we don't have to worry about scaling content management. The vendor will do that for us. The headless content management vendor also gives us a CDN of media. So when we put a binary media into the headless content management system and we access it by URL, that puts it on the CDN, and all of that CDN can be geographically distributed for performance, so our clients can access media directly on that CDN. We don't have to host media for our customers. Again, we have an extensible CMS user interface. We also have the content delivery services. So my content delivery solution is retrieving JSON from my content delivery services. And again, headless uses webhooks for integration. So this is kind of what a headless content management architecture looks like. So we have this hosted content management environment. If we look at this, I don't know if it's visible on the presentation, but there's a gray box here, which is all of this is the vendor's responsibility. The vendor hosts the content management system. They provide media delivery services and content delivery services, and they give us a CDN for media. There's also a CDN for content delivery. So if two clients request the same data, it'll retrieve that from the CMS once, put it on the CDN, and then the second client that retrieves the same data will get it from the CDN. The content management user interface, the browser-based user interface, is actually built on top of content management services and the media CDN. So headless CMS vendors build their browser-based user interfaces using the same APIs that you would use to get data out of the CMS. And again, we have webhooks. So when something happens in the content management system, most often that's going to be published. When you publish content, you might want to clear caches or reindex or do something like that. So we can invoke webhooks that call a URL on an external system to pass data or event information to external applications. So excluding the CMS user, which is the browser accessing the CMS, headless CMS vendors have responsibility for hosting and managing the entire content management environment for their customers. So including content and media management services used to build the CMS user interface, as well as content delivery services that the content delivery tier uses to access the CMS. So in the content delivery environment, this is really just talking about content management, CMS users editing content. In the content delivery environment, where we're serving visitors on the published site, the customer is responsible for the entire content delivery environment. So they need to stand up servers and put software in there, or web servers that they need to export static HTML from the CMS or whatever it is. They need to make the content available to their visitors. So the SaaS Headless CMS vendor is responsible for service level agreements and management of scalability of the content delivery networks for the delivery services of text and binary media. The headless CMS customers are responsible for source code management, build and deployment processes, and hosting of the content delivery services that access the content delivery. The customer is responsible for the content delivery solutions, so the code that accesses the delivery services, which is the data. So this is kind of what that looks like. The vendor, the vendor, here's the SaaS vendor. They have a content management system, their content delivery services and media delivery services. This is all of their responsibility. The customer in the content delivery environment has to manage the source code for the solution. The build process pushes that to the content delivery tier that they manage, and the visitor accesses the content delivery tier. This diagram doesn't really show everything. Like it's possible for this visitor to go directly against the content CDN. So like for a single page application or something, they don't necessarily get the data from the content delivery tier. They can get it directly from the content management system. We can also see that the build process can pull data. So using the same APIs, we might retrieve media or HTML or JSON or whatever and push that to the content delivery tier So anywhere in this process, we can pull data from anything that can use web services or HTTPS can retrieve data from the content management system. So headless content management software vendors or system vendors have responsibility for content management environments and content delivery services. So that's a really important thing. The vendor is responsible for the service level agreement and the scalability of the content delivery services, which is this piece, which actually turns out to be a really big piece. Because if content delivery is simple, just static HTML, and the visitor is retrieving data, using Jamstack or something, then this content CDN is getting a lot of activity, and that ends up being the kind of bottleneck in architecturally in the system. So headless CMS vendors have responsibility for content management environments and content delivery services. Customers have responsibility for hosting and managing content delivery solutions. So basically the vendor is responsible for the data, for managing the data or hosting the data, and the client is responsible for the code. So they know what they want done with the data, and the vendor knows how to manage it. So solution build processes can access CMS services to generate static exports such as HTML or JSON files and replicate content or synchronize content with other data stores. These diagrams don't show all the possible connections such as visitors retrieving content at runtime from the content delivery services CDN provided by the CMS vendor. The content delivery environment and the browser can both access the content and media delivery services dynamically. So the thing is that the visitor needs to have the right security tokens to access the services. So if I want this visitor to be able to access the CDN, then I need to give them a security token that lets them access the CDN. So to summarize headless content management software, it allows customers to use the technologies of their choice. So instead of using .NET and JavaScript, you can use PHP or Ruby or whatever it is that you like. Although I think everybody on this call probably prefers .NET. And I actually really liked using .NET with headless. I thought it was going to be a bad fit, but it turned out to work pretty well. So content delivery code solutions that use the .NET rendering SDK, it's still really tightly integrated with Sitecore in order to support the experience and management features. Our headless CMS is much more loosely coupled. Excuse me. So with a headless content management system, the vendor manages the content management infrastructure, the hosted content management environment. They also manage the media and delivery services, so the infrastructure and the services for pushing out media and text. The vendor provides SDKs for the major technologies. So if I'm a headless CMS vendor and I'm trying to meet all of my customers' needs, I need to put out SDKs for Java, .NET, PHP, JavaScript, so there are SDKs for a variety of technologies. That lets the customer choose which technologies they want in each place. So they might use certain like JavaScript or Node.js for the build process and then use ASP.NET for content delivery. So they're just accessing services so they can use whatever technologies they want. And that lets them choose whatever providers and hosting platforms they want for each piece of it. So headless uses extensions on the UIs, webhooks, and really those microservice APIs, those HTTPS APIs for configuration, extension, and customization. We don't do server configuration and coding on the server to do customization. And really, I mean, probably one of the primary differences between headless and Sitecore is that headless really focuses on the front end. So if you're a Sitecore developer, you're probably doing a lot of .NET backend coding. Even if you're doing content delivery stuff like page layout stuff, you're probably developing .NET components. And with headless, most customers are really much more focused on front end and JavaScript and experience management. Uh, they do through integration instead of back-end coding.
John, I guess you went on mute.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. So I'm not going to spend too much time on the advantages of headless or decoupled. It's something where when you first approach it, it's a little bit challenging because you're used to doing things the way you've always done it, and you don't necessarily see the value. But after you work with headless for a little while, you definitely start to see some of the advantages of decoupling. And it has to do with abstraction. So abstracting systems from each other, that lets you scale each component differently. It's like I can scale content management separately from my databases, separately from my content delivery services, separately from my content delivery infrastructure. So there are some advantages like that. It's very simple. Headless focuses on a single domain, which is content management, and services around data management in generally. So much of the value in decoupling comes with software as a service, specifically to host content delivery services. Content delivery can use the CMS for content as a service. So when we start thinking about content as a service instead of as an application, then we can really think of storing any data in the CMS and treating all of our data the same way instead of treating different pieces of data differently. Headless is really scalable by separating logic, rendering, and data. Headless supports numerous static and dynamic content delivery infrastructures, including content delivery network hosting and serverless or less server solutions. Headless is really consistent, along with UI extension points that can embed data from other systems and provide custom editing interfaces. Headless CMS consistently uses webhooks and microservices for all integrations. So no matter what type of integration I'm doing, I always use those three things: the UI extension points, webhooks, and APIs. I don't have different approaches to integration depending on what type of thing I'm integrating. I always do things the same way. Headless is flexible. Customers can choose the infrastructure, development technologies, deployment tools, hosting solutions, service providers, whatever they want for their content delivery piece. The vendor is doing content management. The customer has to make some choices for content delivery. Headless provides independence. So by minimizing vendor-specific knowledge and code, CMS customers can easily migrate from one headless CMS product to another. Like I said, all of these headless products look very much the same from the content delivery side especially. So migrating from one headless CMS to another is really relatively straightforward. You're just changing how you get the JSON that represents your data, and the structure of the JSON is going to be actually really simple and probably not changed very much. Headless is agile. So by focusing on current web development technologies like Jamstack frameworks, Headless supports agility. So, I'm a .NET programmer and I love .NET, but I have to say JavaScript is more agile in some ways, probably because of the lack of compilation and some of the kind of loose aspects of JavaScript. But a lot of solutions are using Node.js on the server and JavaScript in the browser. And it just seems that by focusing on one set of technologies, they're it's just easier for them to roll out their solutions with a much more simplified build and test process. So headless CMS really are focusing on open technologies like Jamstack frameworks rather than proprietary technologies like Sitecore. Like Sitecore has a lot of proprietary or vendor-specific APIs. So many of these advantages result in lower costs through reduction in development timelines and costs. But of course, there's a cost to that simplification, which is you don't get the experience management features that you get in Sitecore. You don't get the whole content delivery engine. So here's a diagram that kind of shows the differences between the different architectures. On the far left, we have Sitecore's default rendering engine, and we can see there's a content management system. It's interfacing with a bunch of databases, and there's a content delivery system. Those are both running Sitecore, both accessing the same databases. And then the content delivery engine is basically generating HTML and serving it to the visitor. So this is a little bit oversimplified. If we decouple Sitecore, what we're really talking about is taking this content delivery piece and separating it into a set of headless services and separating that from the .NET rendering SDK and the rendering host. So again, with the decoupled CMS, we're running ASP.NET Core, probably .NET 5 on this host that's communicating with Sitecore services over HTTPS, and those services are accessing the database directly. I don't know if anybody has looked into Sitecore Experience Edge, which is Sitecore's hosting content delivery services for at least Content Hub and possibly Sitecore in the future. So customers, maybe not today, but eventually will be able to publish their websites to Sitecore Experience Edge, and that provides the content delivery services. So if we look at the responsibilities, the top is the vendor's responsibility. In traditional Sitecore, the customer has responsibility for everything. In a decoupled Sitecore solution today, the customer actually has more responsibility. They have to now stand up these Sitecore headless services. Um, Probably in the future, this Sitecore Experience Edge is going to support content delivery services for Sitecore CMS. So if I'm just doing XM, not experience platform, but just experience management or just content management, I can use this Experience Edge to scale so I don't have to manage the content delivery services. But if we look at that in comparison to a headless content management software vendor or a SaaS headless content management vendor, their default is to provide all the services. So they have the hosted content management environment, they have the content management services, content delivery services, and media services. The closest thing that we have in the Sitecore environment is Sitecore Experience Edge, which is really the content delivery services and the media, hopefully the media services, but that's some time away. The real thing that this diagram shows is that the customer is still responsible for managing the content management environment, managing all the search and database infrastructure, possibly headless services. Like in your test environments, you're going to be using your own local headless services, not using Experience Edge. Um, in a headless content management system, the vendor is responsible for all those pieces by default. That's part of your pricing in the first place. You don't need to buy a separate Sitecore Experience Edge. And the infrastructure that the customer maintains is really just a rendering host or a set of rendering hosts that use the SDK to access the CMS. So while the decoupled implementation is very much the same, we use an SDK to communicate over HTTPS to get at content delivery services. The layout of the application is very different. Um, in this case, we still know a lot about Sitecore internals. We have to stand up Sitecore solutions and provision databases and things like that. In this case, all we need to do is manage our rendering hosts and our build process to get the data to those rendering hosts. So that's probably enough for this. I can give these slides out if anybody wants to refer to them or get more information about them. And there's some notes in the slides if you want to read those. So here are some differences between decoupled Sitecore and SaaS Headless CMS. With Sitecore, the Sitecore customer manages the content management infrastructure. They also manage the content and media delivery services, unless they use Sitecore Experience Edge. Right now, it sounds like Sitecore Experience Edge is really around Content Hub, and then it's coming for XM in the future, and then eventually XP down the road. With Sitecore, we can only use JavaScript or .NET and possibly some mobile device SDKs. We don't have SDKs for Node.js or Ruby or Java or anything else. So again, if we're JavaScript.NET developers, that's fine. But if we're real Jamstack developers that like Node.js and stuff, then the Sitecore rendering SDK is probably not the best tool for us. We might want to look at JSS or something else. So we also end up with extensive Sitecore specific content delivery code in our content delivery solution. So one of the challenges with Sitecore is that to support the experience editor, anytime we access data, an item or a field, we have to go through Sitecore APIs, which is different from headless because in headless, we always go through JSON. So if I want to retrieve data um, from Sitecore, from the headless CMS, I get a chunk of JSON that represents basically an item that we call an entry, and the fields are just elements of the JSON. And if I want to push that back into the CMS, I push that whole JSON block back into CMS. With Sitecore, anytime I access a field, I need to use a Sitecore API to get at that field value. And I also need to use a Sitecore API to push that field value back into the CMS. And so we end up with a lot of Sitecore specific code, not just for editing values, but also for supporting the page editor, like the layout engine, being able to set rendering parameters or control what presentation component goes where, and also to implement experience management functionality like controlling testing and things like that. So we end up with a lot of Sitecore specific code in our content delivery solution. We use the server to manage integration and customization. So we don't use webhooks. We use a lot of native APIs and web config extensions to manage configuration and extensions. And there's really a focus on in Sitecore, there's a focus on the back end, not just for integration, but for the implementation in general. You're basically, if you're going to be using Sitecore, you're going to be a .NET backend developer. You can try and use JSS to some extent, and you can use SXA, and there are FXM. There are ways to reduce your knowledge of Sitecore and .NET, but really most Sitecore developers are backend .NET developers that work with front end developers. They basically have to translate the Sitecore stuff for the front end developer. So some differences of SaaS from Sitecore, basically saying a lot of the stuff on the previous slide in a different way. Um, the the vendor hosts the content management system, the CMS UI, the media delivery and content delivery services. We have numerous SDKs, so SDKs for a number of technologies that wrap those HTTPS content management and delivery services. We don't need to know much about the CMS vendor. So if I'm a headless software developer, headless CMS developer, I know the JSON formats that I get out of the CMS, and I know maybe the API that I use to get a JSON from the CMS, but that's about the extent of the API that I need to know to program a content delivery solution. So I'm very much more focused on data access and data structures and presentation code, and less on kind of plumbing and pipeline in the background. The customers choose their technologies, their providers, and their hosting platforms. We integrate with UIs, webhooks, and microservices. And probably the biggest thing about headless is it's very focused on Jamstack. So most headless solutions use Jamstack technologies and do the integration on the front end. So using JavaScript tags to integrate with experience management platforms and commerce systems and everything else. So the way we do integration is very different. So that's really, I think, a high level summary um, of how the solutions are different. Some of the limitations of headless CMS, and I couldn't think of a lot of them, but they're pretty significant. So the biggest one is that there's no content delivery engine in a headless content management system. And the content delivery engine is actually where we get a lot of value in Sitecore CMS, especially when we implement Sitecore as an experience platform, because that's how we get the inline editing, the native control of the page layout, the experience management features, and all of that comes from having that content delivery engine and relying on the Sitecore API. If we don't have that architecture of a content delivery engine, then we really can't do those things natively in the CMS. If we did, we'd have content delivery solutions that are very specific to the CMS that we're working with. So, and we really try and avoid that with headless content management. We're really trying to insulate systems and reduce vendor knowledge and vendor dependence. So there are ways to achieve all of these things with headless content management systems, but you kind of have to code them yourself instead of getting them out of the content management solution itself. And again, no back-end customizations or integrations. That might sound like a bad thing, especially if you're coming from a Sitecore background where that's where you do your customization and integration. But the reality is that that's really costly stuff. It's brittle sometimes. It can interfere with other Sitecore functionality, and it can cause challenges during upgrades. So those back-end customizations that can deliver a lot of functionality and value, they also have a lot of costs in terms of implementation and maintenance over time. So by using user interface extensions, webhooks, and APIs, and avoiding that back-end customization and integration, we have a lower total cost of ownership in the long run. We also, one of the limitations of headless CMS, and this is something you can avoid with money, but the vendor will throttle the API requests. So if you haven't paid, for the right hosting plan and you have a lot of traffic, they're going to throttle those requests, which can affect the solution performance. They can also have arbitrary quantity limits. Like if you're trying to retrieve data, you might have to page through records of 100 items or things like that. So because everything's going over HTTPS, they can't just have unbounded queries. And so there are certain restrictions on how much data you can pull back in a single API call. And there are just some other just arbitrary restrictions, and they vary by vendor. Like one vendor might say you can only have 100 content types in the system, or just other restrictions like that. And most of those are really reasonable and you can deal with them. But if you're picking a headless content management solution, you want to know what those are before you pick a vendor. So conceptually, The way I like to look at headless CMS is to think of it as just a UI for editing JSON. So the headless CMS vendor gives us a browser-based UI. We can define some content types. Our users can go in there and edit content, and basically it's storing it as JSON. And then we'll use services to get at that JSON. One of the reasons that things are moving towards headless is that if you look at the way Google is doing search engine optimization algorithms today, performance is like a key metric. And the more we can do statically, the better we can have performance, and that's going to affect our SEO. So that's one of the reasons that solutions are going to static. So instead of having an application server translating data into HTML at runtime, a static solution will actually publish HTML to a web server as static files. And that can have huge advantages because you can embed data from the CMS in that HTML. You can pre-render it all. It's got a lot of performance advantages. Decoupled applications consume services, often from the browser, but an application server or a build process can consume those services as well. Headless solutions define all APIs as HTTPS service endpoints. So any SDK, any API that we're calling natively is just wrapping as service endpoint. We integrate on the front end rather than the back end. We use SaaS whenever possible. If you're not really fluent with the cloud, SaaS is software as a service, which means that the vendor not only stands up the solution, the provisions the and installs the software, but they upgrade it and manage it in place. And that has huge advantages because maintaining the content management infrastructure can be an expensive part of the process. So if we make the vendor responsible for the content management infrastructure, that's a huge responsibility off of our plate. And really, SaaS is the only way to fully leverage the cloud. Any other thing you're doing in the cloud is really just somebody else's machines that, they're providing an abstraction layer over. But SaaS is where you really get the value. So your responsibility as an architect or a developer is to orchestrate solutions from the technologies, services, and providers of choice. So your responsibility differs. Instead of building an application on top of Sitecore, you build an application that interfaces with Sitecore, with search, with commerce, whatever it is that, and so you're responsible for that application instead of standing it up on top of Sitecore. Well, I have a lot more content, but it's really specific, and I think I'm ending up repeating myself a lot. One of the things that I will say is that, one of the reasons we want this .NET SDK from Sitecore is that um, one of the challenges that Sitecore has right now is getting to .NET 5. So Sitecore is built on the .NET framework, and there's a lot of code in Sitecore that can't migrate to .NET 5, and so that means we can't do ASP.NET Core solutions with Sitecore with its layout engine. Um, and the Sitecore rendering SDK, because it doesn't have the dependence on Sitecore, lets me implement code in .NET 5 and solutions with ASP.NET Core. Um, I'm gonna go to just jump ahead to questions and answers. So I'll leave this summary slide up, and I think I'll just open it up for questions.
Thanks, John. So I think I already have few questions. So I'll start asking. So the first question is from Surendra. So it is in decoupled content delivery, we can use JSS, but the problem with JSS is to learn and have resources for Angular, React, and Vue.js. What do you think on having the scope and the future of Microsoft Blazor in terms of .NET SDK, where we can only use C# and develop the website with CMS data?
I think I like the concept of Blazor because I don't like JavaScript. So for me, Sitecore presents a kind of a challenging environment right now for content delivery because I've got so many different approaches. I've got the Sitecore layout engine, I've got SXA that sits on top of the layout engine, I've got the rendering SDK, and I've got JSS. And then now you're raising a fifth one, which is Blazor, which I've never used Blazor with Sitecore. I like the idea of it, but I don't know how those work together. Now, so you've got four and you're adding a fifth. Of those, in the Sitecore context, which is the most viable solution going forward? So I'm not sure whether JSS really works with Sitecore decoupled, the same services that Sitecore Decoupled uses, or if JSS has its own services. But from my perspective, you can either use JSS, or you can use the layout engine, or you can use the .NET rendering SDK. You can't really use all three of those together. That's not really the intention. So which of those would I focus on? So headless is really where the market is going, because, and the reason for that is really around SaaS. The customer wants SaaS. So I would be focused on solutions that support SaaS. The Sitecore layout engine, the traditional Sitecore, cannot support SaaS. The Sitecore, because Sitecore can't get to .NET 5 and we can't refactor the application to .NET Core, it's never, I don't, and because the CMS is so configurable, extensible, each Sitecore implementation is basically unique. And that makes it so that Sitecore can't really manage the content management environment. So I'm not sure what their strategy for SaaS is for content management, but you can see with Sitecore Experience Edge that they are trying to do SaaS for content delivery. And I'm not sure that it's just a buzzword, because this is Sitecore. They've been doing services, and they've been doing JSS, and they've been doing things to move towards SaaS and towards content as a service for a while. And I don't see them changing that direction. There's not that much more functionality that they can build into the layout engine. So the real question is, do I use, so if I'm a JavaScript developer, then I would probably be leaning towards JSS. If I'm a .NET developer that needs to do some JavaScript, then I would probably be looking at the .NET rendering SDK. And I would be probably trying to avoid the layout engine, because I just don't know what because I know that that engine won't be able to migrate to .NET 5, or I think that it won't be able to. I think I'm not going to call it a legacy, but it's not necessarily the way that you would build a solution today. And so I have trouble investing in that architecture. And there are other reasons for that. The more that I use the Sitecore layout engine, the more Sitecore specific code and the more my solution is tied to Sitecore. At least by moving to a decoupled solution, I'm minimizing my interface to Sitecore, and I'm probably avoiding a lot of the things that we might do to customize or extend the content delivery environment, like HTTP pipeline processors or things like that. So it's not just that the implementation is different, but the way I think about the problem is different when I move to decoupled. And by thinking about the problem in a decoupled manner, it changes the way I architect the solution to make the solution more viable for the long term. And so if I'm using Sitecore's layout engine, I'm doing things in a way that is going to make it difficult to migrate forward. Whereas if I use the decoupled, whether I use JSS or use the .NET Rendering SDK, I'm preparing for that future. For me as a .NET developer, I would probably go with the .NET Rendering SDK. JSS has been out there for a long time, hasn't gotten huge traction from my perspective. And I think the actual reason for that is that a JavaScript developer would be unlikely to approach Sitecore, because they know they're going to have to learn a lot about .NET and Visual Studio to use Sitecore. And so they're probably going to head towards a headless content management system. So I don't know if that answers the questions, but you have at least 5 options for Sitecore presentation, and I think only really 2 of them are viable. I wouldn't be using Sitecore's layout engine or SXA at this point. I wouldn't be doing new solutions with those technologies.
Thanks, John. So the next question is again from Surendra. So his SaaS Headless CMS can be good fit for simple website, but let's assume client need to develop e-commerce based website where the complexity is very high with ton of external integrations. Do we have any options for this in SaaS Headless CMS model?
No, it's your responsibility to do those integrations. What I will say is that the commerce engine that you buy, or those external applications, and the most common ones are going to be search and commerce, but there are others like product information management and inventory management and things that you need to interface with. But if you're going to do a headless content management system, you want those other applications to have a similar architecture, which is what we call a mock architecture, focused on microservices, so service oriented instead of native API. Um, API first, so really focused on interfacing through APIs rather than other direct database connections and configuration. Cloud, so really, and when we say cloud, we're really talking about SaaS. And headless, which is, it's kind of a way of thinking about an application where there's an application that exposes services. The UI is an afterthought. So really focusing on the services of the application as opposed to specific functions or user interface components. So in terms of integration, most of the vendors have existing integrations with a variety of other platforms. So they could be experience management platforms, they could be commerce platforms. So as long as those other applications expose services that we can integrate, whether from the browser or from an application server that we manage, um, we can integrate with those applications. Preferably, those applications have an architecture that's very aligned with the headless CMS architecture so that they fit really well together, and conceptually we don't have to learn too much, like this system does things this way and this system does things that way. But the truth is, somebody has to write that integration layer. That integration layer can exist in three places. It can exist in the content management user interface. So retrieving data from the commerce system and embedding it in the content management interface for reporting purposes, or storing product identifiers or things like that in records of the CMS. Um, we can have an application server. So in between the content management system and the browser, we can have an application like an ASP.NET application. I actually think that this is the best and really the only realistic approach for these complex situations. The difference is that that ASP.NET application would be built on ASP.NET Core on .NET 5 instead of being built on Sitecore. So you're already doing these integrations with Sitecore. You might have some pieces that Sitecore provides like commerce, but really even with Sitecore, you're it's common to integrate with third-party commerce tools. And so those integrations you do yourself. In Sitecore, you commonly do it on the back end. The difference is with a headless CMS, you either need to do the integration in the browser, which has certain limitations and risks, or on an application between the content management system and the browser. So for that specific scenario of commerce, I think you need to stand up an application server that is pulling those pieces together. The first place I would look is um, to the content management vendor and see if they provide integrations with commerce tools in general. If they have an integration with a commerce tool, then that architecture can show you how to integrate with any other commerce tool. If they have an integration with the commerce tool of your choice, then you can use that as a starting point for your integration. But I think that you're going to be responsible for managing that integration yourself. So some of the headless solutions, like if you think of Sitecore as a headless solution, it has an integrated commerce platform and things like that. And Episerver is the same way. The standalone headless content management vendors um, do not have those. They integrate with external tools, and they might provide the integration layer for you, or you have to implement it yourself. So it is hard to sell. It's really hard to sell a headless content management system into an opportunity that's looking for experience management and commerce because of that very issue. You can't say it's all in the box. You have to say, well, we have to build an integration. So this is the difference between Sitecore and headless in general. With headless, you basically pick the application that you think is best for each function, like content management, commerce, uh, customer data management, whatever it is, and then you have to stitch those together. And usually that stitching is a combination of an application server and some JavaScript that runs in the browser that pulls services from the different vendors.
Thanks, John. The third question again comes from Surendra. For which kind of web solution we should not use SaaS Headless CMS model?
Okay, so the first thing that I would say is that if you have a customer where you feel that their solution is really an experience management platform, so if they're primarily focused on experience management features like personalization, segmentation, individualization, testing and optimization, email distribution, engagement automation, if you think about all of the stuff that's in the experience database itself, and that's what the customer really wants. They want to test every component on the page and optimize it with AI. That's a better fit for a experience management platform like Sitecore, definitely. Otherwise, you're going to have to stitch these services together yourself. And stitching the services together yourself is not that big of a deal when we're testing, two or three elements on 15 or 20 different pages. But if we're testing 30 or 40 elements on thousands of pages, doing that stitching might not be the most appropriate thing. And especially when we start, if the customer really has the Sitecore vision of we're going to do personalized email and we're going to track the user and push them through engagement plans, that that's a better fit. If the customer, if the so one of the challenges that I see in this industry in general is that the vendors come in and the customer loses track of their original objectives. They get sold on these bells and whistles about things that they could do. So I always try to get the customer to focus on their real core deliverables or where they're going to get the most value out of the solution, and prioritize those use cases. So if the customer cannot define their use cases of what they want for experience management, I think that that's a real problem, and you need to step back and do strategy before you do platform selection. If they can define their use cases and they're relatively limited, then a headless content management system it makes more sense, especially if those use cases don't depend on historical data. If we look at a lot of use cases for experience management, it'll be things like, well, if the referring site is XYZ, then do this. Or, if the search term is this, then do this. That really doesn't depend on long-term collected data about anonymous users. And so those relatively simple use cases we can meet with cheaper, easier technologies. If the customer has lots of use cases around experience management, then I think an experience management platform makes more sense. So, but I would also say that by my default for a content management solution would be a headless content management solution. The only reason that I would consider Sitecore is if I need experience management stuff. I don't think that Sitecore can sell as a CMS very well anymore, because the CMS they see as kind of a commodity, where the experience management is where they add their differentiating value. So if it's CMS against CMS, I think almost any CMS is going to win over Sitecore. If it's CMS against experience platform, those are two different markets, and Sitecore has a definite advantage there. So I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, John. So the fourth question from Yuraj. If we see Sitecore going fully headless SaaS model, then we will lose inline editing feature, that is the experience editor. Any more challenges that we see here?
So I actually disagree. If Sitecore goes completely headless, we won't necessarily see the loss of those features. We would need to use something like the .NET Rendering SDK to keep supporting those features. I would expect to have something like the Experience Edge doing the hosting. Um, the real impact from my perspective of Sitecore going to headless would be elimination of all the server-side configuration and customization that we do, especially in the content management environment. So my history with Sitecore is we implement more customizations in the content management environment than in the content delivery solution. In the content delivery solution, we might be doing some HTTP begin request pipeline processors or something like that. Relatively minimal stuff that we could do other ways using .NET technology without Sitecore. In the content management environment, we're doing all sorts of stuff that is very Sitecore specific. And whether it's with configuration files or calls to .NET APIs, we wouldn't be able to do that in a headless solution. So the integrations and extensions in the content management environment are probably the biggest challenge for Sitecore going to a SaaS model. And if we think about where Sitecore is possibly going, I think it's extremely unlikely that they can refactor Sitecore CMS to .NET Core. And I think that they need to get to .NET Core and they need to get to SaaS. And I'm not sure that that's going to be possible. If you look at what's happening with Experience Edge currently supports Content Hub. And so it kind of feels like Sitecore is migrating some content management functionality to Content Hub, and that doesn't mean they're going to obsolete Sitecore CMS anytime soon, but it makes you question their strategy. Is the strategy really about pushing Sitecore CMS into the cloud, or is it about migrating Sitecore CMS customers to Content Hub, which is already in the cloud? And yeah, so I'm not inside Sitecore and I can't figure out what their strategy is, but they're moving in a variety of directions. Like they've already got XDB and then they just bought a customer data platform. So there's another one where I'm questioning, well, what does that mean? Like, am I going to migrate my XDB data into this customer data platform, or am I going to integrate those two things? So for me, the more options that Sitecore gives me, the more confusing it is, and the harder it is to make choices about, well, which of these is the path that Sitecore is taking forward. Um, so again, if Sitecore wants to move to SaaS, then that experience edge is key. That experience edge needs to support not just content delivery, but experience management. So experience as a service. If we think about a headless content management system, it's basically content as a service. I call an API or I call a URL and it returns JSON. Sitecore needs to implement experience the same way. So I pass an API and some tracking data. I pass a URL and some tracking data about my visitor to an API. Sitecore stores that for me and lets me use the data for personalization. Doesn't really matter whether the content delivery solution is running Sitecore or not. I want to be able to use the experience data in Sitecore to personalize my experience. So I think that that's part of Sitecore's headless strategy is to do experience as a service. And I'm not sure in what order things will happen. I think experience as a service has to come first. And I don't see that happening in 2021. I think it's possible. And then it would be like 2022 or later that Sitecore got to actual content management on a SaaS platform. So I think you have a while before that happens. I don't think that it really affects content delivery and experience management functionality in the content delivery environment as long as I use, Sitecore supported technologies to get at the data like JSS or the rendering SDK or the layout engine. But I think that customization and configuration is the big impact. And I think it's a long time. Sitecore CMS is a great industry to be in. Like the last 20 years I've been in this industry, there's always work, always good revenue. Sitecore is a particularly good niche because the pay is high and the customers are big customers. And that will continue for, some number of years, especially if Sitecore makes the right choices about moving to SaaS. What I would be worried about with Sitecore is if they don't make the right choices from here. So if they keep spreading out, buying other technologies partially to buy those customer bases and they don't integrate and focus on SaaS as a strategy, I think that would be like where I would start getting concerned about Sitecore. But especially with the new CEO that's come in, they seem to be making the right moves towards SaaS from my perspective. And the reason I say SaaS is because, if anything you're doing, you're going to cut down your costs by moving to SaaS. I can't really describe it other than it's just so much easier. If I want a content management system, I go to a website and request one and it's up in about 5 minutes versus Sitecore where I have to, get a license and download software and install it and go through that whole provisioning process. And that's just the install process. Basically everything that you go through with a headless content management system is pretty straightforward, where sometimes when you're looking for an answer about Sitecore, you could be really spinning your wheels. So by simplifying the process, the application, and using consistent open technologies, the learning curve for a headless CMS is much smaller. So I don't know if I answered the question at all again, but any other questions?
Yeah, thanks, John. We have a lot, but
Oh, really? Okay.
I'll try to moderate it with just answering one of those questions, which covers 3 or 4 questions in it. So
Okay.
another question from Surendra is, in Headless CMS, how to utilize Sitecore marketing features?
I'm sorry, say that again.
So in Headless CMS, how to utilize Sitecore marketing features?
How do I implement or how do I do what with the marketing features?
It's about utilizing the marketing
Oh,
features.
utilize. Okay, so the headless CMS does not provide any marketing features at all. So if I need to do something like testing, I need to implement the infrastructure to support testing. And so there are a variety of ways to do this, and this is not really my specialization. I can implement the solution in the content management system. So maybe I create 2 different fields for the different variants, or I create 2 different what we call entries, which are like items with the 2 different variants. And then I need some presentation logic to apply the different variants. And then I need a place to record that. So I can implement that myself, or I can use an external engine for that kind of stuff. So there are external engines like, I don't know the names of all of them, but basically in the same way that Headless is providing content as a service, they are providing experience as a service. So when we put some JavaScript tags in our pages that pass the data to those external services, So that's tracking the visitor. And then once the visitor is tracked, we can do the personalization. So we call back into that system to get the data out. So those are the two approaches. You either have to build something completely custom in the content management system and in your content delivery environment, or you have to integrate with an experience management service. And my preference would be typically to integrate because the integration, one of the things I don't want to do is manage the data, to be honest with you. XDB grows indefinitely, and if I'm doing experience management that's tracking my visitors, that data set that I'm collecting is going to grow indefinitely, and I don't want to manage it. I want to have a vendor that knows how to manage that data and scale it and do those kind of things. Another thing is that, like the PII concerns, I would expect that, or I would confirm that my experience platform vendor is managing the PII concerns for me. So I'm not accidentally, exposing myself to legal risk by storing data that I shouldn't be storing. And then an experience platform vendor is going to be very focused on the specific use cases that they need to support what I need to do. So it'll make it a lot easier to implement the solution and avoid me stepping in potholes. So, if I have very limited requirements for experience management for marketing features, then I would try to build them myself. If I have kind of a medium amount of experience management features, then I would try to integrate with an experience platform. Or if I had a very large number of experience management features that I needed to do, then I would look at experience platforms instead of a headless content management with experience as a service platform. So I'm not, the truth is it's always going to take smart people to build websites. The difference between things is like, where do you focus? So if I'm doing solutions with Sitecore, I'm very focused on learning Sitecore. If I'm doing solutions with headless, then I'm very focused on things like JSON and JavaScript. So of those, which is more supported, which has a larger developer community, where can I find developers cheaper? How do I get questions answered? If I focus on JSON and JavaScript, I have a huge advantage over Sitecore. Sitecore has a great technical community and you can always get every question answered. It's just, if you're asking a question about JavaScript, it's already been answered. You can just search and you'll find the answer. Whereas if you ask a question about Sitecore, you're waiting to find the one person that's done that specific problem before, or things like that. So I don't know if that answers the question again, but any integration, any experience management work that you need to do, or that the solution needs, you're going to need to implement either in the CMS or in some kind of integration layer between the CMS and the application.
Thanks, John. So next question comes: the Sitecore JSS framework is tightly coupled because of Sitecore layout service. In this, what will be the best option to utilize Sitecore headless CMS, like using API mode only to build loosely coupled application? And if we are using SaaS Headless CMS, then if ask for personalization, then we have to use third-party add-on, example Contentful content as a service offer add-on.
Yeah. So the second part of that question is definitely true. Anything that you need on experience management, you need to integrate with a third-party service or implement the solution yourself. The first part of the question, I'm not totally sure I understood. So yeah, Sitecore JSS is tightly coupled with the layout services. If I were to use JSS, the reason that I would want to use JSS is to get to something like a headless solution. And so I would be really looking at the static export tools that JSS gives us. So if I understand correctly, that will generate HTML files that contain JavaScript that can consume the services and retrieve the content at runtime and do all of that kind of work. Uh, because that's really the only value that I'm getting by using Sitecore with decoupled. So if I think about why does JSS exist? JSS is kind of a stopgap. So it's for SPAs and things like, or it was intended for SPAs and things like that. So Sitecore as is not necessarily the greatest thing for SPAs and Jamstack kind of stuff in the first place. So JSS was kind of a stopgap to get there. And then headless started to really pick up share, and Sitecore has continued to invest in JSS as a competitor to headless in general. And again, one of the values of headless is getting to this static content delivery that uses services. There's no avoiding the tight coupling with Sitecore. As long as you want to support the inline editing features and that, then there's no avoiding that tight coupling. And this is really one of my biggest challenges with Sitecore is, that tight coupling. If you're a Sitecore developer and that's where you make your money, that's great. There are a lot of problems when another developer comes in and tries to take over that solution. If that solution is all just JSON and JavaScript, the next developer is going to have an easier time with it than if it's a lot of Sitecore.net API coding, and that even if it's JSS, the more times that I'm calling into Sitecore to get data, the more I need to know about Sitecore, and the harder it is to take ownership of that code. It's much easier for a developer. If I'm working with the headless CMS, I don't even think about the APIs really. I think about the JSON format that I get back. It's very easy for a developer to work with JSON. Even in .NET, JSON's really easy to process, or JavaScript, or wherever it is. If everything needs to be some specific Sitecore API, my knowledge needs to be a lot higher. And that's true no matter which layout, which presentation technique I use with Sitecore. So again, I'm really not sure if I answered the question, but yeah, I mean, JSS is, no matter what you do, whether you use the layout engine, SXA, JSS, or the .NET Rendering SDK, all of those are really tightly coupled with Sitecore, and it's to support those things. If you think about just the page, I mean, Sitecore had this recommendation that you put a tag in every single page, the robot detection tag. So everything like that I have, every Sitecore specific, makes my solution more tied to Sitecore. I need Sitecore developers to maintain this. I need Sitecore architects to architect it. And if I don't have that, I can just use web developers, and it's a lot cheaper and faster to get things out.
Thanks, John. So, in context to that, I have next question from Gopi Krishna. That is, how .NET developers can prepare themselves for all these changes in CMS world?
Okay, so this is a really good question. So it's going to be frightening at first. It's a paradigm shift. It really is a paradigm shift. If you're coming from Sitecore and moving to headless, or moving to all of my interfaces with other applications occur over HTTPS with JSON, it's actually really simple. So if I wanted to implement a headless CMS with .NET, if I think about what the CMS does, all it does is make data available as JSON. And so I don't need to know how it's implemented. I call a .NET API, I pass an identifier, and it passes back JSON. And then I basically create a class, a really simple POCO, that represents that JSON, and it automatically deserializes the JSON to my POCO. So that's really the extent of it. Honestly, it's so much easier, so much simpler to do a headless content management system, and it's a really good fit for .NET. So what I would do, if you really want to start looking at it, I would start by looking at my blog, deliverystack.net, which is really taking a look at headless CMS from a .NET developer's perspective, and especially on content delivery. But I've been trying to push .NET into headless content management solutions for about a year, and I have made no traction. So I thought, well, there are some Sitecore solutions that are, they're looking to get to headless, and maybe we can sell .NET into those opportunities to help them transition off of Sitecore. But nobody wants that really. So people are trying to move away from .NET. And for me, it's tragic because what they're moving to is JavaScript, and I don't like JavaScript. So if I were a .NET developer, I would be making a choice right now. Do I want to move towards JavaScript and Jamstack technologies, or do I want to move away from web development? Because I just don't see ASP.NET picking up share. It's really unfortunate because ASP.NET is really good technology. It's open source at this point. It runs on Linux, Windows, or even Mac. It's high performance. It's got all the functionality, strong typing, link, all of the value that we have in .NET. And it's actually a really good fit for headless content management software. It's really simple. The problem is that the market is moving to JavaScript. So if you want to stay in web development, you kind of have to be a JavaScript developer, at least part-time at this point. There's going to be less and less, from my perspective, less and less C# coding for web solutions over time. ASP.NET actually has some really good advantages in this environment. Um, one, one thing that a lot of companies are trying to move to serverless. So even if I have, there's no such thing as serverless, right? There's less server solutions, but the customer doesn't want to maintain those solutions, the infrastructure. They just, so if we think about serverless, instead of standing up an application server, I write some .NET code, I deploy it to the cloud, and the cloud figures out when to stand up an application and how to route traffic to it. So there's still a server there, but I'm not managing the server. And ASP.NET really fits that model well. And so do things like when we start breaking up an application into functions, then our application is less of a monolith. So I might have, a set of functions that do something like search interface and a set of functions that do something else like product or inventory or commerce interface. And when we start breaking the application up into those services, we can implement and manage those services separately. So, commerce services might be implemented on Node.js, where content services are on ASP.NET, and we have this flexibility of bringing these things together in different ways. And it's really an enabling thing, but it's very psychologically challenging because you've spent some number of your years of your career doing things a certain way. You're going to have to make this shift. This is how applications are going to be constructed in the future. This is how most applications are being constructed today. And so I would start learning the app architecture, and I would start focusing on JavaScript. And then, you know, in terms of learning, I would look at the deliverystack.net blog and ask me questions about things that are not clear there. But I just don't think that ASP.NET is going to have a huge market in headless content management, unfortunately.
Thanks, John. So I think we have taken too many questions, but the last question, and I think you have already answered it, but I'll repeat it once. So if the organization does not need personalization, candidate for Sitecore XM and want to have a headless solution, then does it worth to invest a big amount in purchasing Sitecore, or better to opt in for suitable headless CMS that can save some cost?
So you're not going to save costs immediately, depending on which headless CMS you go with. So different CMSs are priced differently. There are some ones that are basically similar in pricing to Sitecore and some that are much cheaper. So you could get away with a low cost content headless content management solution. Excuse me. You could get away with a low cost headless content management solution for that case where you don't have experience management requirements. Um, But again, the real cost with Sitecore is not necessarily the hosting and the licensing costs, although those are significant costs. It's the maintaining that content management environment and upgrading it. And so you're also, whether you're reducing your licensing and hosting costs initially, you're reducing your long-term maintenance costs either way. So I just would not stand up Sitecore unless I had an experience management project, because the infrastructure and hosting and all that is more expensive than I need. I know I can do it more cost effectively on a headless content management system. Well, it sounds like we're at the end of our time, and so
Yes.
I appreciate everybody for attending.
So,
And
just a minute, John. Thanks. So, I just want to announce that Surendra and Gopi has won the Amazon vouchers for good question. And John, it will be your turn to select two lucky winners from the list of our participants.
okay, so I just pick any random two people.
Yes.
I got to figure out how to get to the participants window. All right, I'm going to just go by number here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Balaji?
Balaji. Yeah. Balaji and Swan. Okay.
What?
And
What? And I'm going to go with Kedar. Kedar Moore.
Kedar More. Yeah.
More.
Thanks,
Okay.
John. Yeah.
Sure.
So, congratulations to all four Amazon voucher winners. And I'll just hand it over to Vinod. So, John, can you just stop sharing your screen?
Yep.
you.
Yeah, so thank you, John, for a wonderful session. So first of all, I would like to thank each and everyone who is on the call. Thank you for sharing your valuable time with us. Secondly, I would like to thank our speaker, John, for presenting a good knowledgeable session for all of us. Last but not least, we want to thank our partner, Jet to Travel Technologies, for sponsoring this event. So, winners of this session will get their Amazon vouchers in 3 working days on their mail IDs. And finally, an update.